The chair scraped against the marble floor of the grand atrium, and every alien head in the chamber turned at once. That sound, that single, sharp scrape of a human chair being pushed back, had stopped 214 delegates mid-sentence. I know because I counted them later. I had nothing else to do in the weeks that followed except count things, replay moments, and wonder if the universe had shifted the instant Secretary Nakamura stood up. She did not raise her voice. She never did. That was the thing about Caroline Nakamura that the other species never understood. They had spent 40 years waiting for humanity to get angry, to pound a fist on a table, to deliver some dramatic ultimatum wrapped in fire and noise. That was what they expected from us. We had a reputation. After all, a species that had clawed its way out of one small blue world, survived its own worst impulses, and then arrived at the doorstep of galactic civilization, with all the patience of someone who had already waited long enough. She simply stood, smoothed her jacket, and began to read. I was standing just behind her left shoulder, as I always was during formal sessions. My role as first delegate was largely ceremonial at that point. The decisions had already been made, the documents already signed back on Earth. On a Tuesday morning in Geneva with very little fuss. I had been told 3 days before the session. I had not slept well since. Atrium was the heart of the Galactic Council, a vast circular chamber cut from pale stone that the Thrinosi had quarried from an asteroid, built 2,000 years before humanity discovered fire. The ceiling arched overhead like the inside of a cracked egg, its surface covered in bioluminescent panels that shifted color according to the emotional temperature of the room. They were supposed to run cool and blue during formal proceedings. That morning they had already begun drifting toward a nervous, uncertain green. Each species sat in a tiered ring, the oldest civilizations at the center, the newest at the outer edge. We had been at the outer edge for 40 years, and that was exactly the point. Nakamura's voice carried without effort. She had that quality. She spoke the way someone speaks when they know every word is being recorded and analyzed and translated into 37 languages simultaneously, and they simply do not care. She said that the United Earth Government, acting on behalf of all member nations and by unanimous resolution of the Global Parliament, was formally withdrawing its membership from the Galactic Council, effective immediately. She said it without dramatics. She said it the way a person reads the weather. The chamber did not erupt. That surprised me. I had expected something, a gasp, a shout, the sharp clicking sound the Vorath made, with their secondary jaw plates when they were agitated. Instead, there was a silence so complete I could hear the soft hum of the atmospheric processors in the walls. Then Director General Orvathi, seated at the inner conclave's raised platform at the center of the room, leaned forward. She was a tall, silver-skinned Thrinosi with 4 eyes set wide on either side of her long, narrow face. I had always found her expression unreadable, but in that moment she looked exactly like someone who had just stepped onto ice, they thought was solid and felt it give. "Secretary Nakamura," she said. Her translator rendered it in perfect English, as always. "This is not a matter to be announced. This is a matter to be discussed." Nakamura did not look up from her paper. "We discussed it for 40 years, she said. She set the paper down on the table with the smallest, softest sound, and she turned and walked toward the exit. The rest of our delegation followed. I was the last one in line. At the door, I paused for one moment, not for effect, not for drama. I just needed a second. I looked back at that enormous chamber, at all those eyes watching us, at the green ceiling slowly shifting toward a color I had no name for, at Orvathi still leaning forward as though the act of leaning might bring us back. I thought about the 40 years, the engineers we had sent, the medical research we had published and shared without restriction, the 12 peace negotiations humanity had quietly facilitated in back rooms and over late-night calls, none of which appeared in any official council record. The communication relay network that connected every inhabited system in the known galaxy, which 3 human software teams had built over 7 years and then handed over freely. The universal translation matrix that every delegate in that room was using at that very moment, running on human-designed architecture, maintained by a team of 12 people in a basement office in Cape Town. I thought about the 40 years, and then I walked out. We did not slam the door. The door was on an automatic hydraulic system. It closed with a soft, expensive click behind me, and I stood in the corridor outside the grand atrium and listened to the silence on the other side of it. Nakamura was already 10 paces ahead, hands clasped behind her back, walking at exactly the pace she always walked. Deputy Delegate Owen Marsh fell into step beside me. Owen was a tall, quiet man from Yorkshire who had spent 22 years in galactic service and had the permanent expression of someone who had heard everything and been surprised by nothing. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Do you think they understand yet?" I thought about Orvathi's face. I thought about the green ceiling. I thought about the Vorath delegate, a broad, gray-plated creature named David Kaur, who had been frantically swiping through data on his personal tablet the moment Nakamura began reading. I had seen enough of Vorath body language to know he had been pulling up trade dependency charts. "Not yet," I said, "but they will." Owen nodded slowly. We walked the long corridor toward the shuttle bay, our footsteps echoing off the ancient stone walls. And I kept my eyes forward and my hands steady, and I did not let myself feel anything at all until we were through the airlock and the door to the council station was sealed behind us. Only then, in the narrow metal corridor of the human shuttle, did I lean against the wall, close my eyes, and take a breath so deep it made my ribs ache. Outside the viewport, the council station hung in space like a jewel. Beautiful, ancient, and already, in some way I could not yet articulate, diminished. Not because we had left it, but because it had never occurred to anyone inside it that we could. That was the thing they had never understood about us. We were patient. We were generous. We were, by the standards of galactic civilization, extraordinarily young, and we had spent our entire membership trying to be good partners and good citizens and good neighbors. We had never once threatened to leave. We had never once rattled our contributions over their heads like a weapon. We had just left. And in the shuttle bay, as the engines warmed up and the stars outside the viewport held perfectly still, I thought that the silence we had left behind us in that chamber was probably the loudest thing humanity had ever said. 6 months. That was how long it took before the council sent its first unofficial message. Not an official diplomatic communication that would have required acknowledging that humanity's withdrawal was real and permanent, and the council was not ready to do that. It was an unofficial message, routed through a Keth collective trade attaché who happened to be stationed near New Carthage Station, where I had been living since the withdrawal. New Carthage was a human deep space hub positioned at the edge of the Vareth corridor, one of the busiest trade lanes in the known galaxy. I had chosen to stay there rather than return to Earth because Nakamura had asked me to, in her characteristically quiet way. She had said, over a video call from Geneva, "I'd like someone I trust watching the corridor," and I had understood what she meant. She wanted eyes. Not surveillance, exactly. More like the feeling you get when you leave a room and want to know what happens after you leave. What happened was more interesting than either of us had predicted. I kept a log. I had always kept logs. It was a habit from my early years as a junior attaché, when my supervisor had told me that the most important events in galactic diplomacy were almost never the events that made the official record. The real story was in the margins, the hesitations, the small procedural failures, the moments when something that was supposed to work simply stopped working. The logs from those 6 months were, in their way, the most remarkable thing I had ever recorded. The first problem appeared 14 days after the withdrawal. It was small enough that most observers missed it entirely. A trade arbitration dispute between 2 mid-tier Vorath shipping consortiums had been filed with the Council's Dispute Resolution Office. Under normal circumstances, the case would have been routed through a piece of software called the Equitable Commerce Framework, an arbitration system that cross-referenced 340 years of galactic trade precedent and produced binding resolutions within 72 hours. The Vorath loved it. Every species did. It was fast, it was fair, and it had never once produced a ruling that was successfully appealed. It stopped working on day 14, not catastrophically, not with an error message. It simply began returning incomplete outputs. Cases submitted would sit in the queue for days, then weeks, and emerge with rulings that referenced precedents incorrectly, or failed to account for current exchange rates. The Vorath filed a technical complaint. The Council's technical department investigated. They found, buried in the system's architecture, a suite of maintenance scripts that had been running silently in the background for 6 years, written in a programming language that precisely 2 people in the Council's technical staff could read. Both of those people were human. Both of them were no longer employed by the Council. The scripts were patching and updating the framework continuously, not dramatically, not in any way that produced visible changes, but in 1,000 small ways that kept it calibrated against current trade conditions. Without the patches, the system was running on data that was 6 years out of date. The Council's technical team spent 3 weeks trying to replicate the patch scripts. They managed to produce something that worked adequately. Not well, adequately. I noted it in my log with no particular emotion, the way a doctor notes a symptom. The second problem was more visible. In the Peloran sector, a region with 12 inhabited systems and a history of territorial disagreement going back 2 centuries. 3 separate border disputes had quietly escalated. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the speed of the escalation. What had previously taken 12 to 18 months to reach a level requiring formal council mediation now took 6 weeks. The disputes were not more serious than previous ones. They were just moving faster. I knew why. I had watched the council's mediation process for years, and I knew things about it that were not in any public document. There was a network of human diplomatic liaisons, not official mediators, not formal representatives, who operated in the Peloran sector quietly. They attended trade events. They went to the same restaurants as local administrators. They made friends. When tensions rose, they made phone calls. Informal ones. The kind that never appeared in any record, but that somehow resulted in a sector governor agreeing to delay a contested mineral survey by 6 months, or a local commander agreeing to relocate a patrol route by 30 kilometers. None of those people worked for humanity anymore. Most of them had come home. A few had taken positions with the New Human Coalition, which I will come to shortly, and those were not focused on the Peloran sector. So the disputes moved faster, and the council's formal mediation process, which was elegant and well-designed and hopelessly slow, could not keep up. I noted this also. The third problem was the one that broke into public view. It happened on day 112. I remember the exact number because I had started counting from the day we left, a habit I had developed and could not seem to stop. The Universal Translation Matrix, the system that made every conversation in the Grand Atrium intelligible across 37 languages and 42 dialects, began producing errors. Small errors at first, a Threnosi phrase rendered slightly too formally in Keth, a Vorath idiom translated as literal rather than figurative, turning a diplomatic pleasantry into something that sounded vaguely like a territorial claim. The delegates caught most of them, but some they did not. On day 119, an inter-conclave session had to be suspended for 4 hours when a routine procedural motion was mistranslated in a way that 3 species heard as an accusation. The session produced no resolution. The 4 hours were spent in what the official record called clarification proceedings, and what a Keth delegate privately called, in a message later leaked to 3 different news networks, the most stressful afternoon of my 30-year career. The translation matrix required continuous tuning. Every month, a small team in Cape Town updated it with new vocabulary, new idiomatic developments, new diplomatic terms coined in recent sessions. It was the kind of work that never appeared on any budget line or organizational chart, because it had always been done quietly by people who cared about it. Those people had not been replaced. I remember the day the leaked Keth message appeared on the news feeds. I was having breakfast on the observation deck of New Carthage Station, watching a cargo convoy assemble in the corridor below, and Owen Marsh sat down across from me with a cup of coffee and slid his tablet across the table without a word. I read the message. I set the tablet down. I picked up my own coffee. 61%, Owen said. I looked at him. That's what the Threnosi analyst's report says. He took a sip of his coffee, the one that's been circulating in the council's internal network for the past week. 61% of the council's operational infrastructure runs on systems of human origin. I got it through a contact in the Keth trade office. She wanted us to know they'd seen it. I sat with that number for a moment. It was not surprising to me. I had always known the number was large, but seeing it expressed so precisely had a particular quality to it. The way a diagnosis feels different from a suspicion. What did the council do with the report? I asked. They classified it, Owen said. And then someone leaked it to every major news network in 4 sectors. It's been viewed 11 million times in the last 48 hours. I looked out at the cargo convoy below. Long haulers and mid-range traders, moving in their careful, organized way through the corridor, following traffic management protocols that had been designed by a human logistics team, and were now maintained by a small automated system that, I happen to know, had not been updated in 7 months. The analyst who wrote it, I said, the Threnosi one. Exiled, Owen said simply. Her home government pulled her credentials and recalled her from council service. Apparently, the report was not authorized. Where is she now? Owen gave me a look that was not quite a smile. That, he said, is an interesting question. Her name was Vetha Oral, and she was 26 years old, which in Threnosi years made her very young indeed. Old enough to have studied, not old enough to have learned to be quiet about what she found. She had written the report because she had been assigned to audit the council's technical dependency matrix as a routine administrative task, and she had found what she found, and she had reported it. because that was what a person was supposed to do when they found something important. The fact that the something important was deeply embarrassing to the council's senior membership did not seem to have occurred to her as a reason not to report it. I found that quality in my experience to be rarer than it should be. Owen had her location, I had a shuttle. We had a conversation about it over coffee for approximately 4 minutes, which was longer than was really necessary. Meanwhile, on Earth, Nakamura was receiving the first of several increasingly urgent messages from the council's diplomatic office. Not requests, exactly, not yet. More like the conversational equivalent of someone clearing their throat loudly in a room they hope you are still listening from. I received copies of them, as I was still technically first delegate in an inactive capacity. The messages were careful, measured. They spoke of ongoing shared challenges and frameworks for renewed dialogue, and the Council's deep respect for humanity's historic contributions. They were, in the language of diplomacy, the textual equivalent of a proud creature asking for help without being willing to say the word. Nakamura replied to each of them with a single line. Earth's position remains as stated. We are available for direct talks should the Council wish to schedule them on terms we consider appropriate. The Council kept sending the messages. Nakamura kept sending the single line. This continued for 3 weeks. Then, on day 161, the Council formally requested a summit. I was on a shuttle to a small station in the outer belt when Owen forwarded me the message. I read it twice. Outside the viewport, a string of human-built navigation beacons blinked in the dark at precisely timed intervals, marking the corridor's center line. Beacons that had been placed there by a human survey team that ran on a power system designed by a human engineer in a small office in Auckland that had been reliably blinking in the dark for 11 years, without a single person in the Council ever noticing they were there. I thought about those beacons for a long time. Then I forwarded the message to Nakamura with a single added note of my own. They are ready to talk. Are we ready to listen? Her reply came 8 minutes later. It said, start packing, and find Beth Aurel. I want her in the room. I leaned back in my seat and let out a breath I had been holding for 6 months. Outside, the beacons blinked on, patient and regular, doing exactly what they had always done, unnoticed and indispensable, right up until the moment they weren't. The shuttle bay on New Carthage Station had a window that looked directly out over the Vareth corridor, and on the morning the Council delegation arrived, I stood at that window and watched their ships come in. There were 7 vessels, 4 from Consultal member species, 2 from the Inner Conclave Secretariat, and 1 unmarked diplomatic courier that I recognized as Threnosi Government Registry by the configuration of its drive array. Director General Orvathi had come personally. I had expected that. What I had not expected was how small the convoy looked against the background of New Carthage. The station had grown considerably in the 6 months since the withdrawal. Humanity had not been idle. 3 new cargo processing rings had been added to the outer hull. The docking registry showed an average of 240 vessels a day passing through, which was up from 160 a year ago. There were now restaurants on 4 different levels serving food from 11 species, a medical base staffed by 6 human doctors and 2 Drevathi biologists who had arrived 8 weeks earlier and immediately made themselves indispensable, and a small park on level 7 someone who had planted earth grass in hydroponic trays, and the soft green of it, under artificial sunlight, had a quality that made people slow down when they walked past. I watched the 7 Council ships dock, and I thought about what they were about to see. These were people who had spent their careers in the Grand Atrium, at the center of galactic civilization, and they were arriving at a human station they had probably never visited before and finding it busy, confident, thoroughly alive. I had arranged the meeting room with Owen's help, not the formal conference hall, which was large and imposing and would have encouraged the wrong kind of dynamics. A medium-sized room on level 4, with a table that sat 20 comfortably, good lighting, and a full viewport looking out over the corridor where, at any given moment, a dozen human-flagged ships could be seen going about their business. That view was not an accident. The Council delegation was led by Orvathi, with a support staff of 9. She walked into the room without any visible sign of emotion, which was, for a Threnosi, the equivalent of a very controlled mask. I had spent years learning to read past it. The slight stiffness in her secondary neck muscles told me she was carrying significant tension. The speed at which she glanced at the viewport, a quick, involuntary look before she corrected herself, told me the station had registered on her, in a way she had not prepared for. Nakamura was already seated. She rose when Orvathi entered, offered a courteous nod, and gestured to the chairs opposite. She did not extend her hand. That was a human gesture and Thrinosi did not use it, and Nakamura never made the mistake of offering gestures that the other party could not reciprocate. I took my seat beside Owen, who had his quiet, neutral face arranged precisely as usual. Veth Oral sat 2 seats down from me. She had arrived at New Carthage 4 days earlier, on a small independent transport, with 2 bags and an expression of someone who had been making very fast decisions and was still catching up to them. Owen had debriefed her the same afternoon, and then I had spoken with her over dinner, and I had found her exactly as I expected. Sharp, calm, slightly stunned by the path her honesty had taken her down, but not regretful. She had brought with her a copy of the full dependency report, not the leaked version but the original, unredacted one, which included 18 pages of supporting data that the leaked version had not contained. Nakamura had read it overnight and returned it to her in the morning, with 3 pages of her own notes clipped to the front. Orvathi opened with pleasantries as protocol required. She spoke about the long history of productive engagement between humanity and the Council. She spoke about the importance of shared values and collective responsibility. She spoke about challenges and opportunities. She was very good at this. She had been Director General for 14 years. Nakamura listened without expression. When Orvathi finished, there was a brief silence, and then Nakamura said, "Director General, would you like to tell us what you're hoping to achieve today? Or shall I tell you what we're prepared to offer?" Orvathi's 4 eyes settled on Nakamura with the particular quality of someone recalibrating. "I would be glad to hear your position," she said. Nakamura nodded once and then she looked at me. I stood. I had the document in my hand. A single-bound copy, the kind you print on real paper when you want to make clear that something is not provisional. Not a draft, not a conversation starter. I placed 1 copy in front of Orvathi. Owen placed copies at 3 other points around the table. "Humanity's terms for re-engagement with the Galactic Council," I said, "are as follows." I read them clearly and without rushing. A permanent co-equal seat on the inner conclave for the Secretary General of the United Earth Government, with full voting rights on all matters. A rotating council presidency, beginning with humanity in the 2nd cycle, following a single transitional term. A formal addendum to the Council Charter, acknowledging the contributions of human civilization to the Council's operational and technical infrastructure, to be enshrined as an amendment rather than a preamble. Legally binding, not decorative. And finally, full membership consideration for any species or independent system currently aligned with the human coalition, to be processed under standard criteria within 18 months. I sat down. There was a silence long enough to become a presence in the room. Davith Kaur, the Vorath delegate, spoke first. He was seated to Orvathi's right, and his broad gray plates had taken on a faint reddish flush that I recognized as the Vorath equivalent of agitation. "These terms," he said, with careful precision, "are not proportionate to the situation." I looked at him. "What situation would that be, Delegate Kaur?" "The situation of re-engagement," he said. "You are asking for the inner conclave seat. That seat is allocated by seniority." "We've been members for 40 years, I said. The Verath were given an inner conclave seat after 31. The Verath situation was different. "Yes," I said, "it was. They threatened to reroute their trade corridor. We just left." I let that sit for a moment. "I'd suggest ours was the more restrained approach." Kaur's plates flushed a deeper red. Orvathi raised one hand, a slight gesture, and Kaur settled back. "Ambassador Voss," Orvathi said, using my title for the first time. "The inner conclave seat cannot be granted by my authority alone. It would require a full council vote." "We know," I said. "We're prepared to wait for that vote. We'd suggest scheduling it within 30 days. 30 days is not sufficient." I finished, and I kept my voice even and without any edge. "Director General, the Equitable Commerce Framework has been running on 6-year-old calibration data for 4 months. The Peloran sector has 3 active territorial disputes that your mediation office has not been able to process fast enough to prevent them from escalating further. Your translation matrix produced a diplomatic incident in a conclave session 2 weeks ago that cost you 4 hours and produced no resolution. We have the technical capacity to address all 3 of those problems within a week of re-engagement." I paused. "We are not asking for 30 days out of urgency. We are asking out of courtesy." The room was very quiet. Outside the viewport, a human-flagged long hauler was making its steady way through the corridor, its running lights blinking in the dark. Orvathi looked at the document in front of her. Then she looked at Nakamura. Something passed between them that was not in any translation matrix and did not need to be. The particular look of 2 people who had both known, for a long time, how this would end, and were only now arriving at the moment of saying it aloud. I will need to convene the inner conclave before I can respond formally, Orvathi said. Of course, Nakamura said pleasantly. The meeting recessed. The council delegation withdrew to their quarters on level 6. Nakamura walked to the viewport and stood there for a moment, looking out at the corridor. She'll push back on the coalition membership provision, she said. Not to anyone in particular. Yes, I agreed. She won't be able to hold it. No, I agreed again. Owen, from across the room, said nothing, but refilled his own coffee cup with the air of a man who had just watched something he had been expecting for a long time finally happen. Veth Arl was still seated at the table. She had not spoken during the meeting. She had not been asked to, and she had understood that her role was simply to be present, a living reminder of what the council had done to people who told the truth, inconveniently. She was looking at the document at the 4th provision, the one about coalition membership. Will they agree to it? She asked. I looked at her. They'll resist it for approximately 2 days, I said, and then they will agree to it, because the alternative is watching us build a second galactic body that works better than theirs. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Is that what you're doing? Building a second one? I thought about the honest answer to that question. I thought about New Carthage, and the docking registry running at 240 ships a day, and the Dravathi biologists on level 4, and the grass growing under artificial light on level 7. We're building something, I said. We haven't decided what to call it yet. I kept my log every day during those weeks, the way some people pray, not because I expected anything in particular to come of it, but because the act of writing things down made the strange feel real, and the real feel manageable. Looking back at those entries now, I notice how often I wrote about small things. The smell of coffee in the early mornings on New Carthage, the way Owen always left his jacket on the back of his chair during long sessions, as though he expected to be there a while. The Dravathi biologist named Sael, who had started growing tomatoes in the medical bay window and left small paper bags of them outside the doors of whichever rooms had lights on late at night. The large things were happening everywhere around me. The small things kept me oriented. The coalition had begun before the withdrawal. Not formally, nothing was formal until it needed to be, but the conversations had been happening for 2 years, in hallways and over shared meals, and in the kind of quiet, unhurried way that produces real things rather than declarations. Humanity was not the only species in the Galactic Council who felt the weight of the outer ring. There were others. Some of them had been at the outer edge longer than us. Some of them had been told, in language more or less direct, that they were welcome to attend but not to expect. The first species to reach out to us formally had been the Dravathi. They were a small, quiet people, smaller in stature than most council species, with 4-fingered hands and large, pale eyes that seemed to take in more light than ordinary eyes. They came from a world in the cool outer edge of their sun's habitable zone, and they had a cultural patience that made even humanity look impulsive. They had been council observers, not full members, for 60 years. 60 years of attending sessions, contributing technical analyses, submitting reports that were read and filed and acted upon without attribution. Their deputy director of stellar sciences, a woman named Calla Weir, had contacted Owen 8 months before the withdrawal, through a channel so indirect it took me several days to reconstruct the path. She wanted to discuss mathematics. Specifically, she wanted to discuss the mathematics of the FTL drive array that humanity used on its long-range vessels, which she had been studying from published technical documents for some years. Owen arranged a call. I sat in on it by accident. I had been in Owen's office for an unrelated reason and the call came early, and I remember thinking, within the first 10 minutes, that this was one of the most remarkable conversations I had ever witnessed. Calla Weir was quiet and unhurried, and she spoke about the drive array the way a musician speaks about a piece of music they love deeply, finding in it things that the composer perhaps did not consciously intend. She had identified an inefficiency in the field resonance pattern that our engineers had simply worked around because working around it was easier than solving it. She had solved it, theoretically on paper in her spare time, in a small office on a world the council had never invited to full membership. It was an 18% efficiency improvement. Our lead propulsion engineer, when she saw the proof, sat quietly for a long moment and then said, with characteristic understatement, "Well, that's quite something." That was the beginning of the coalition, though we did not call it that yet. We called it a research exchange, then a technical partnership, then an economic cooperation framework. Names are important. They tell you how far along something is in the process of becoming real. By the time we walked out of the Grand Atrium, There were 11 other species and 4 independent systems involved in what we were quietly building. By the time Orvathi arrived at New Carthage, there were 16. What they had in common was not grievance exactly. It was more like a shared recognition. They had all been told, in one form or another, that their role was to participate rather than to shape. They had all contributed, in their various ways, to a structure that attributed the results to those at the center. They had all continued doing it because the alternative, leaving or refusing or demanding recognition, seemed to carry too high a cost, and then humanity had demonstrated what the cost actually was. I wrote about this in my log on day 140, sitting in a small common room on New Carthage at 2 in the morning, with a cup of cold tea and the low sound of the station's environmental systems as a background. What I wrote was this: the council had confused acquiescence with contentment, and it had made that mistake about species after species and for generations. It was not a malicious mistake exactly. It was the mistake of people who are comfortable enough not to need to question the arrangement makes them comfortable. Comfort is a kind of blindness. I had seen it in the Grand Atrium for 40 years. The Vorath and 3 other inner conclave species had, in their panic following the dependency report, done exactly the wrong thing. They had filed a formal motion to classify the human coalition as an unlawful parallel structure under an obscure council charter provision that had been designed originally to prevent monopolistic trade organizations. The motion was technically valid. It was also strategically the single most counterproductive move they could have made, because it required them to acknowledge the coalition's existence, its membership, and its scale in an official council document that was now part of the permanent public record. The motion had been viewed, as of my most recent count, 32 million times. Callawere sent me a message the day it was filed. It said only, "I think they may have miscalculated," I replied. Yes, she sent back a single number, 18. The percentage improvement on the drive array. I think she meant it as a joke. It was also the most efficient summary of the situation I had encountered. The summit recessed, as I said, after the initial session. Orvathi had asked for time to consult with the inner conclave. She did not ask for much time one day. That told me she had already consulted with them, that the outcome was largely decided, and that the one day was for the choreography of the response rather than the response itself. During that day, I walked every level of New Carthage. I did this partly out of restlessness, and partly because there was a thing I had been meaning to do for several weeks and had not found the right moment for. I found Sael, the Dravathi biologist, in the medical bay, and I asked if I could sit with her for a few minutes while she checked on her tomatoes. She said yes, with a particular warmth that Dravathi had for unexpected requests. The tomatoes were doing well, small, round, dark red ones, growing in 4 hydroponic trays on the wide windowsill, fat and bright under the grow lights. She had planted them because she had eaten one on Earth during a visit to the botanical gardens in Singapore, and had been so affected by the taste that she had brought seeds home, and then brought them here. "Do the Dravathi have tomatoes?" I asked. "Nothing like this," she said. "We have a root vegetable with a similar nutritional profile, but the taste is entirely different, more bitter, more complex in a way, but not as immediately satisfying." I thought about that for a moment. "Callawere," I said. "She's your cousin, isn't she?" Sael smiled. Dravathi smiled in a particular way, a slight widening of the eyes rather than the mouth. "My mother's sister's child, yes. We grew up in the same district." She looked at the tomatoes. "She has always been the family genius. I am just the one who grows things. You improved the secondary oxygen filtration system on this station's level 3 by about 14% last month," I said. "Owen told me." "The Dravathi have a saying," Sael said. "Every growing thing improves the ground it grows in." I sat with that for a while. Outside the medical bay window, a view of the corridor, the patient procession of ships. The next morning, Orvathi accepted our terms. Not all at once and not without negotiation. The inner conclave seat required formal council ratification, which she could not deliver in the room but could deliver within 30 days, and she said so. The coalition membership provision required, she said, a modification to the timeline, not 18 months but 24, along with standard criteria review. Nakamura's counterproposal was 20 months, with a joint human council review board. Orvathi accepted it in 11 minutes. It was the fastest concession she had made in 14 years of tenure, and I watched it happen with a calm that surprised me. The formal re-engagement charter was signed on the table in that medium-sized room on level 4, with the corridor visible through the viewport and a cargo convoy assembling in the middle distance. It was not a ceremony. There were no cameras present because neither side had wanted cameras. There was coffee, because Owen always made coffee, and there were the small paper bags of tomatoes that Sale had left outside the door that morning, which sat in the center of the table and which several delegates ate during the signing, because they were very good tomatoes. Orvathi signed last, and as she set down the stylus she looked at Nakamura for a moment, with an expression that was the closest I had ever seen her come to something unguarded. "You were always going to have these terms," she said. It was not an accusation. It was closer to the sound of a conclusion being reached. "Yes," Nakamura said simply. "You could have demanded them 40 years ago." Nakamura looked at her with a patience that had the particular quality of patience that has been exercised for a very long time. "We were trying," she said, "to be good partners." Orvathi held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and picked up the signed document, and I had the feeling that she was holding something heavier than paper. The grand atrium looked the same. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked back through those doors, 6 months and 22 days after the last time I had been in this room. The same pale stone walls, the same arched ceiling with its bioluminescent panels, the same rings of seats arranged by seniority, the same vast circular floor at the center where the Director General's platform stood. But the flags were different. When I had last sat in this chamber, there had been 43 flags hanging from the upper gallery. 43 member species, arranged in order of admission, a long arc of colors and shapes that curved around the chamber above the heads of the delegates. Today there were 57. 14 new flags hung among them, each one representing a species or independent system that had been, until very recently, either an observer, an affiliate, or simply overlooked. The Dravathi flag was there. Pale silver with a geometric pattern that looked like a cross-section of a crystal structure. It was the most recently admitted flag. It was also, I could not help noticing, the one hanging nearest to the center. I had been back in active service for 16 days, long enough to re-establish my credentials, attend the formal confirmation session at which the inner conclave seat was ratified by a full council vote, and sit through 11 hours of what the council called integration consultations, and what the rest of us called figuring out how to put things back together. Long enough also to watch Veth Aurel, now officially a council-affiliated independent technical analyst, a new category created specifically for her situation, walk through the same doors I had once watched her be effectively exiled from, and do it without any visible display of emotion, with only a slight set to her jaw that I recognized as the look of someone who has been right about something for a long time and has finally been acknowledged as such. The session was a formal one, called to ratify the amended charter. It was long and procedural, and largely without incident, the way significant things often are when the significant part has already happened and what remains is the official record of it. I sat in the human delegation's chairs, which had been moved for the first time, from the outer ring to the second ring from the center, a small distance in physical terms, the kind of distance that takes 40 years to cross. Owen sat beside me as he always did, with his quiet face and his notebook. He still kept a paper notebook, in an age where everything was recorded digitally. He said it helped him think. I had long since stopped questioning it. During the fourth procedural segment, when the formal reading of the charter amendment was underway, I let my eyes move around the room. David Kaur, the Vorath delegate, was seated in his usual place, his gray plates their usual color. He was watching the proceedings with an expression of careful neutrality. Once, during the reading of the provision about human contributions, his eyes moved briefly in my direction. I met them without expression. He looked away first. Kalawir was seated in the new Dravathi delegation section, in a chair she had presumably never expected to sit in. She was not watching the speaker. She was looking at the ceiling, at the bioluminescent panels, which were running a steady, calm blue. I wondered if she was calculating the spectral frequency of the light, the way a person runs a measurement on something almost out of habit. She looked, from where I sat, entirely at peace. Sale had not come. She had stayed at New Carthage, which was still her home, and she had sent a short message the morning of the session that said, "Watching from here. The tomatoes are coming in well." I had read it over breakfast and felt something that took me a moment to identify. It was something close to gratitude, and also close to recognition, the feeling of understanding exactly what someone means by something that is, on its surface, about vegetables. The amendment was ratified. The vote was 39 in favor, 12 abstentions, 6 opposed. The 6 opposed were all inner conclave species who had held their positions for more than 60 years. I noted them in my log not out of any particular feeling, but because the record mattered. After the formal session ended and the chamber began to empty in the slow, shuffling way of large gatherings, a young Thrinosi came to stand beside me. She was perhaps 22 years old, which in Thranosi years was very young, and she had the look of a person who has rehearsed something and is not quite sure how to begin it. She was wearing a council staff badge. Ambassador Voss, she said. Yes, I said. I am assigned to the council's new technical integration office, she said. We are the team working on the translation matrix calibration. She paused. I studied the system documentation, the original architecture. I wanted to say. She stopped. Started again. The people who built this system. They did something very difficult, and they made it look very simple. I looked at her for a moment. They'd be glad to hear that, I said. She nodded carefully. I wanted to ask, I know it is not the usual way, but is there any way to contact the original development team for consultation? Some of them are still active, I said. Most of them are in Cape Town. Owen, I said, turning slightly. Can you get this person a contact in Cape Town? Owen, without looking up from his notebook, produced a card from his jacket pocket, an actual paper card, which he apparently kept ready for exactly this kind of situation, and held it out. The Thranosi took it with both hands the polite way. Thank you, she said. Do good work, I said. She nodded and moved away through the emptying chamber, and I watched her go and thought that she would, in fact, do good work. The chamber was almost empty now. Nakamura had left early. As she often did, she had never been one for lingering in rooms after the work was done. Orvathi was still on the platform, speaking quietly with her staff. The bioluminescent ceiling was beginning to dim toward its end-of-session cycle, the blue fading gently. I stood at the edge of the floor near the outer ring. The same spot, more or less, where I had stood the last time I was in this room. The spot where I had paused for 1 second before walking out. Owen came to stand beside me. Different, he said, which was for Owen a long speech. Yes, I said. We stood there for a moment, the two of us, in the quiet of the emptying chamber. I thought about the 40 years. About the engineers and the doctors and the negotiators and the quiet people in the Cape Town basement who had tuned the translation matrix month after month and never asked to be acknowledged. About the beacons blinking in the dark of the Vareth corridor, unnoticed and indispensable. About a Dravathi scientist who had solved a problem in her spare time that our engineers had been working around for years, and about the tomatoes growing in the medical bay window of New Carriage Station, bright and round, and exactly as improbable as everything else. We had not come back because they needed us. They had needed us for 40 years, and that had not been enough. It had not even been noticed. We came back because this was ours to shape. It always had been. We had simply spent a very long time being polite about it, and then we had spent 6 months being unavailable. And now we were here, in the second ring from the center, with 57 flags in the upper gallery instead of 43, and a young Thranosi with a paper card in her pocket walking toward a contact in Cape Town who would pick up the phone on the first ring. We came back because the work was still here, and the work was what we had always been about. That was the thing the council had never been able to categorize. They could measure humanity's technical contributions and our diplomatic output and our economic footprint. They could audit the systems we built and count the disputes we resolved and track the communication relays we maintained. What they could not measure, what they had never thought to look for, was the reason we did it. We did it because we were interested, because we were curious, because we had come from a world that had taught us, through a very long and very difficult education, that the only way through the hard problems was together. And we had taken that lesson and carried it with us into space like a habit we could not shake. We did not need gratitude. We had not left because we stopped caring. We had left because we had been told, in every way except direct language, that the caring was expected, but the recognition was not. We had made our point. Now we were back to work. Orvathi descended from the platform and crossed the floor toward the exit. She passed within a few meters of me and paused. We looked at each other. Ambassador, she said. Director General, I said. She held my gaze for a moment. The translation matrix team in Cape Town, she said carefully. Tell them thank you. I thought about that. I thought about how those 2 words had taken 40 years and a galactic near collapse to arrive. I thought about how much easier everything might have been if they had arrived earlier. I will, I said. They'll appreciate it. She nodded once and walked out. I turned back to the chamber, almost empty now, the ceiling fading. The flags of 57 species hanging still above the quiet room. Owen closed his notebook. Home, he said. Not yet, I said. I want to write something down. He nodded and found a nearby chair and sat, patient as always. While I pulled out my own notebook, I had started keeping a paper one, because Owen had eventually convinced me by example. And I wrote the date at the top of the page and I began. Outside in the Vareth corridor, the beacons blinked on in the dark, steady and unhurried. doing exactly what they had always done. We were not finished, we were barely started. But for the first time in a very long time, we were exactly where we were supposed to be.